So, very warm welcome to everyone from press and media at the closing press conference of the European Parliament's Investigation Committee's delegation for the Pegasus software and its use. The delegation is concluding a 2-day mission with this press conference to Budapest, and I would like to give a very, very quick information to you as well that this is not the first visit that the delegation is achieving. They have been visiting Israel, Greece, Cyprus and Poland already, and there will be a report and recommendations later during the spring from the delegation side. I would just like to also add that you can reach interpretation Hungarian on Channel 5, English on Channel 1, and we will have time for some questions afterwards. I will hand out the microphone as the media requests. I would like all those who are asking questions to give their media and their name, also for interpretation purposes. At the end, members of the delegation here present are also available for interviews, quick interviews, if would you wish so. Please try to approach me so I can forward the request. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Chair of the delegation and the rapporteur. I hope to pronounce the name, Jeroen Lenaers, and Mrs. Sophia Intveld.
Thank you. Thank you very much. An excellent pronunciation. I know I don't have an easy name for traveling. Thank you all very much for your interest in our mission here in Budapest. I hope that the sound is good for everyone. I have to say this is one of the most beautiful locations we've ever organized a press conference. So in that sense, it is a positive aspect of our mission here. And, you know, or frankly, there weren't that many positive aspects in that sense, so we have to treasure what we have. Our meetings today and yesterday have allowed us to better understand reports of spyware misuse in Hungary and how it ties into the larger political context. Our members of the parliament that joined this delegation, we represent 6 different political groups and 5 different member states, and each, of course, with their own interest and their own questions to the guests that we have met. We had an interesting program, but I have to say that it's highly regrettable that the Hungarian government declined our invitation only very shortly before the mission did officially begin and without a proper justification, meaning that there was no open dialogue with the government. Instead, Justice Minister Varga chose to attack us with often repeated conspiracy theories about foreign forces threatening Hungary. And this is not, I would like to emphasize this is not how you engage with representatives of European citizens. And I think it says a whole lot more about Minister Varga and her lack of respect for democratic dialogue than it says about us. In any case, it seems that transparency and dialogue are not this government's way of working. We did meet with the president of the Hungarian Authority for Data Protection, Dr. Attila Péterfalvi, as well as members of the Hungarian National Assembly representing parties of the government and the opposition. These discussions were constructive, and I would like to thank our interlocutors for agreeing to meet with us. However, many questions we had as a delegation remained unanswered. Going into the substance of our talks, everything indicates that spyware was grossly abused in Hungary. We have been presented with explanations of how judicial or political authorization of surveillance works in Hungary, and we have asked how so many seemingly harmless people ended up on the list of surveillance on grounds of national security. Are demonstrators, journalists, lawyers really such a threat to public safety, public security, and the integrity of the state that such abusive, invasive spyware needs to be used? We have not heard sufficient information during our visit to justify the intrusive surveillance of those victims. As a reply, we have often heard national security used as a blanket reason to target anyone with opposing views to the government's agenda. This broadness is very problematic, and we find citing national security as a reason an unconvincing explanation. The European Commission has stated that there are limits to espionage that can be conducted on the grounds of national security. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Authorities also need to abide by the European Convention on Human Rights and EU legislation and case law, including on the right to privacy, notably the e-privacy directive. We urge the Hungarian authorities to follow up EU law and safeguard fundamental rights and provide citizens of Hungary with proper options for redress. Here in Hungary, it is clear that people feel that their basic rights are systematically violated. Having spoken to media figures, journalists, civil society representatives, it is clear that people feel threatened and harassed because of their professional activity. Those who investigate the government, those who ask questions about its policies or participate in protests have been under constant targeting by this government and its bodies for years. Strong evidence indicates that this has been done to gain political and financial control over the public sphere and the media market. And such campaigns go against the basic principles of liberal democracy and rule of law, and they need to stop immediately. Victim protection and legal remedies in Hungary are insufficient, as targets of spyware are not notified after the surveillance has ended, which goes against the existing case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And we urge the government to properly notify targets of surveillance and to also clarify the types of crimes or suspected crime that can justify putting citizens under surveillance instead of an extremely wide definition of national security. We see the reports of spyware abuse and surveillance in the wider context of the rule of law issues in Hungary. And everything we've heard in the past 2 days underlines the importance of an independent and impartial justice system. Currently, the Minister of Justice has broad powers to authorize spyware use, and vaguely defined urgency procedures can be used to conduct wide-reaching surveillance. We think that spyware deployment should be under proper judicial oversight. At the same time, there are doubts over the independence of the Hungarian National Authority for Data Protection, which is supposed to oversee spyware operations. The European Court of Human Rights has already concluded that the authority cannot effectively oversee spyware operations, and we urge the government to act on this ruling and reinstate a truly independent process. Unfortunately, the Hungarian Parliament's National Security Committee couldn't conduct fact-finding inquiries on the use of Pegasus because of the pro-government majority in the committee who blocked it, showing that they have no interest in answering to questions seriously and transparently. And we call on the authorities to allow meaningful investigations of abusive practices. We will present our in-depth findings and recommendations in our final report under the leadership of our rapporteur, Sophie In 't Veld, and which we expect to finalise in the committee level in April. In them, we will propose solutions that will help safeguard citizens against abuse. Already, we can say that we find the lack of independent ex-ante and ex-post control deeply worrying, as the supposedly independent authorities or bodies have been appointed directly by the ruling party. We are convinced that the situation described above is a serious breach of the rule of law and basic democratic standards, and we condemn it. We deplore efforts to silence and intimidate the media, protesters, and even the opposition, since all these are vital elements of a pluralistic, functioning democracy. Hungarian citizens deserve accountable and transparent institutions that safeguard their rights impartially, regardless of party affiliation or political opinion. And we will use our means to support European citizens in Hungary in their efforts to protect their rights and enjoy freedom and rights, including the right to privacy. Concluding, I would say, for me, what has been my main gist of the 2 days we had is that everything indicates that spyware has been grossly abused in Hungary, and that I find the authorities' explanation very unconvincing. Strong evidence indicates that people have been spied on with the objective to gain even more political control over the public sphere. And I'm convinced that the rule of law and basic democratic standards have been seriously breached here. and the situation in Hungary is among the worst in the European Union. As a result of years of democratic backsliding, state institutions do not seem to be geared towards serving citizens and protecting their rights and freedoms, but rather to serve the political objectives of the government. We call on the authorities to allow a meaningful investigation of abusive practices, and as a committee of inquiry in the European Parliament, we will propose solutions that will help safeguard citizens against such abuse. Thank you, and I'll pass the floor to our rapporteur, Sophie In 't Veld.
Thank you, Jeroen, and I too would like to thank everybody for their presence here and their interest taken in the topic. Let me start by going back to the core question: what is spyware and why is it so poisonous? Spyware is extremely invasive. It essentially takes over your mobile phone. And that means every aspect of your private life. So it's not just a, let's say, a wiretapping device. It gives access to all your files, your pictures, all the apps you're using, your entire history of communications, location, everything. So that's something to keep in mind. People sometimes think this is only about wiretapping, but it's much more invasive. It has an impact, and this is a second remark, not only on the fundamental rights of the individual, which it impacts in very obvious ways, but also on the rule of law and democracy in the broader sense. It has an impact on society because it's used to target people who are vital for democracy, journalists, NGOs, politicians, both opposition politicians, but in many cases we also see politicians of government parties being targeted. I'm not referring specifically to Hungary, but more generally, to keep them under control. It has a chilling effect on many people. I think we often get the question like, but what about your phone? Are you absolutely sure that it's not infected? And no, we cannot be absolutely sure. We have our phones checked every once in a while, but you can never be absolutely sure. Now, I don't think that any of us present here will be held back, but for many people it can have a chilling effect. And that means, you know, that you get to the heart of democracy. And I would therefore say that the abuse of spyware is the biggest threat to democracy at this moment in time, because it's used by those in power to hold on to their power in many different ways. Now, second point, the argument made by the Hungarian government and indeed by many other national governments, basically, this is none of your business. That's what they're saying. Very wrong. It's very much Europe's business. First of all, because every single member state is a part of the European Union, and it's like gangrene. You don't have gangrene in one body part, you have gangrene in your entire body. So if something is wrong with the rule of law and democracy in one member state, it affects the European Union as a whole. And let's not forget, let's say that with the use of spyware you can manipulate elections. Well, that directly affects the composition of EU bodies. Not just the European Parliament, but also the European Commission and the European Council, the Council and the European Council. So it has an impact directly on decision-making in the European Union. So it is very much our business. You can make the same argument with a legal justification. Article 2 of the treaties is the most important article of the treaties. Article 1 just says, hello everybody. Article 2 is about the values of the European Union. Every member state has signed up to that. As a matter of fact, Hungary was the first member state to ratify the current EU treaty, and I'm sure that they didn't overlook Article 2. It wasn't hidden somewhere in a footnote. Article 2 is the core of what the European Union is all about, and I think Mrs. Varga knows that very well, given her extensive experience in Europe when she was still pro-European. Then you have to see, as Jeroen also said, you have to see spyware in context. Of course, spyware can also be used for legitimate purposes, for tracking down really bad guys, big criminals, terrorists, what have you. But abuse is too easy. And we have to realize that spyware is never an end in itself. Spyware is just a tool. It's a tool in the toolkit. And it's being used by governments inside and outside the European Union for the purpose of oppression. It's being used to target opponents and critics. It's being used to silence opponents and critics. It's being used to figure out what your opponent is doing. And in that sense, it's completely corrupting, let's say, poisoning democracy. There are many other tools in the toolkit, so you cannot study the topic of spyware in isolation. It is, as Jeroen also said, it is to be seen in the broader context of attacks on democracy and the rule of law. I think all the criticism and concerns with regard to the attitude of the Hungarian government have already been voiced by my colleague. I think, on paper there are already big weaknesses in the Hungarian system, but the reality is even worse. Because even if you have proper oversight bodies, like the data protection authorities, if they have been completely captured by the government party, then they're not independent anymore. And what we have seen over the last 2 days is unfortunately confirming what we already knew, namely that any avenue for remedies, oversight, safeguards have all been closed down. And that is extremely worrying. And I think the criticism of the Hungarian government is well known. It's not new. It goes back to the early days of the current Orban regime. And contrary to what you read in the media, it is not actually some sort of left-wing conspiracy, but it has been established time and time and time again by independent international bodies such as the European Court of Justice and many others. But I would also like to use this podium to criticize the European Commission, because what we also see is that many laws are being violated when it comes to the abuse of spyware, data protection laws, privacy laws, but also in a more general sense, export rules of the European Union. And we see, and we've also heard from the interlocutors today in particular, that the European Commission pretends it has no duty to enforce European laws. And I would really call on the Commission to more actively defend the values of the European Union. The Commission has a duty to do so. It's not optional. It's not a hobby. It's in the treaties. The European Commission is the guardian of the treaties. The point is that the Commission seems to think that, whatever national governments are doing, it's okay for the simple reason that they are national governments. In the intergovernmental logic of the European Commission, the Commission has no duty to enforce European laws when those laws are being violated fairly blatantly, in this case, by a national government. So, two final remarks. I think we have seen, as you all know, that the European Commission or the European Union is withholding EU funds from the Orban government. I think that is extremely sad and tragic for Hungarian people who are entitled to support from Europe just like anybody else. But if I look at the attitude of the Orban government, it's entirely justified. Because being a member of the European Union means that you play by the rules and you respect the standards. And you cannot expect other Europeans to be solidary if those standards are not respected. So I would like to echo the words of my colleague and call on the Hungarian government to very, very rapidly remedy the situation. And this is not something vague. There are very concrete things that the Hungarian government can do, such as implementing the so-called Szabo and Visi ruling from 2016. You'd say that they've had plenty of time. Finally, you may be aware that as a rapporteur, I had already submitted a draft report. It is, of course, the peculiarity of an inquiry committee that you're at the same time working on a report and amendments, and in parallel still conducting the inquiry. Unfortunately, there is no other way of doing that. But of course, our findings of these 2 days will feed into the report, and I also sensed a great degree of consensus, I think, across the political parties on the concerns. So that will feed into the report, and there will be, on the one hand, the report laying down the findings, so describing the situation as it is, what is happening, and on the other hand, there will be recommendations in a resolution making policy recommendations for the future. They will be general recommendations, but also specific, country-specific recommendations for Hungary. You can find all these documents on the website. But we will further enrich those documents with findings of these 2 days.
So, dear colleagues from the media, Chair and the Rapporteur are ready for questions. So please, if you have one, raise your hand and tell your name and media.
Thank you very much. This is Balázs Korodzkai from Index. My first question will be, do you have any knowledge if there is any difference how the Spanish government used Pegasus software and how the Hungarian government used this spyware? And if so, there is any difference between them?
Thank you. Well, it's a fair question to ask. I would like to inform you that next month we will do a similar delegation visit to Spain in order to get more information about the way this kind of spyware has been used in Spain. So I would not feel comfortable already giving any conclusions on this now. And I also am not sure how useful it is to compare. In a sense, we have investigated the situation in Hungary. We have come to the conclusion that the way it has been used in Hungary does not follow the standards that should be followed. We find it entirely unconvincing that so many individuals that are targeted with spyware, that are all journalists, activists, lawyers, etc., media figures, the only thing in common is not a criminal conspiracy, but it's the fact that they're critical of the government. And this is very concerning on its own merits. So I'm happy to come back to the question on Spain in a month after we visited Spain, and we can also have a press conference like this where we share our conclusions about Spain. But for now, I think our conclusions should really focus about Hungary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, René.
Thank you. My name is Barna Bodnár from Club Radio. The Hungarian prosecution said they have closed the investigation because there were no unauthorized monitoring. And you just said there is strong evidence that there were. How do you think they missed this kind of information during their investigation?
Well, strong evidence. The point is, first of all, we get no information at all, so it's very difficult to say. But if you look at the people who have been targeted, it seems very implausible, to put it mildly, that they are all a threat to national security. And if they were a threat to national security, you would expect that at some point they would be charged with something, but that's not the case. If you look at the case of Mr. Baudouin, the Belgian-Canadian citizen who was also one of the targets, I believe the charges, some of the charges against him were dropped. So that would indicate that he's not a threat to national security. And I believe the only charges that are still pending against him are that of carrying a paper knife. Well, if that makes you a threat to national security, I would gather that 90% of the people in the streets are a threat to national security. The point is that it's just very difficult to really scrutinize because you get no information. The other thing is that although Hungary is one of the countries that does have an official definition of the notion of national security, it is so broad that it could be anything. So, you know, that maybe that is an explanation, I don't know, but maybe that's one of the explanations why the Data Protection Authority has said everything is legal. Everything is legal means that there is a law covering it. Does it mean that that is legitimate? I don't think so. And if you look at the scale of the use, that also raises question marks. So. Besides, if it were all legitimate, then you really wonder why the government authorities are so reluctant to cooperate with any kind of scrutiny or investigation. If they've got nothing to hide, what's the problem?
Thank you. My name is Zsolt Tarkányi from RTL News Hungary, and my question would be, you explained your previous visits in European countries such as Cyprus, Greece, and Spain, maybe. Yeah, and you said that the Hungarian government declined your invitation. Did the same happen in any other countries before?
In Poland, we had a similar situation where the government refused to meet with us. In Cyprus and Greece, there were meetings with ministers or representatives of the ministries. So there is a difference between some countries, but Poland and Hungary are very much on the same situation in this regard. Well, we were very critical on this in Poland, and we're very critical about this in Hungary as well, because it's not just refusing an invitation. First of all, Minister Varga here claimed that because this was about national security, the European Union has no competence and has nothing to do with it. We reject that. It's not about national security, it's about rule of law. Secondly, she wasn't apparently courageous enough to write it in the letter to me, but then I saw later a public statement where she also said that the government does not want to cooperate in Hungarian and European left activity funded by George Soros, and I think this is just a completely ridiculous statement, a conspiracy theorist statement that is shameful for any government official to use in this regard.
But the real revelation of this mission is that you are left-wing now.
I know, I cannot go home with this accusation hanging over me. No, but jokes aside, because this is very serious. A government that instead of engaging in democratic dialogue, that governments should be the normalest thing to do. Instead of engaging in democratic dialogue, they come with conspiracy theorist attacks on democratically elected members of the European Parliament. And I think, apart from the rejection of the invitation, this says a whole lot about this current government in Hungary, as it did in Poland, because these are governments that are not interested in scrutiny, that are not interested in checks and balance, that are not interested in democratic dialogue. And it's a very sorry conclusion, I have to say a very regretful conclusion about the state of politics in Hungary today.
I'd like to add something, because I entirely agree with this. I have to say, though, that it's also a matter of tone. Because we also have to recognize that not a single government in the European Union has been willing to cooperate with our investigation. And it is true that in some other countries we were met by government officials or officials of government bodies who were very friendly and forthcoming but didn't share any relevant information with us. So then the question is, you know, was that more useful? We have written to every single government in the European Union asking them for very basic information, and they're basically denying it. Either we get a reply which is totally meaningless, or they refuse to reply at all. And here I think that there's a handful of governments which are clearly abusing spyware for political purposes. then there are also governments who are somehow involved in the illegal exports of spyware, because this is a business which is run from various countries. But we also have to conclude that even those countries who are completely clean, who are using spyware only in a legitimate way, who are doing nothing wrong, but they are also protecting the practices that we have seen here in Hungary, because there is this collective silence. It's like I've called it omerta. They seem to think that it's more important to be friends with government leaders than it is to protect democracy for all of us. And I think spyware, as I said at the start, is at the moment the biggest threat to democracy in the European Union. It's the digital version of, let's say, the siege of Capitol Hill or the storming of the Brazilian parliament. We haven't had nobody has stormed the European Parliament, maybe because we have 2 seats in Luxembourg and Brussels. They didn't know where to go. But this is creeping. This is. Oh, somebody telling me the weather. Okay, but it's invisible. People don't realize the risks, the chilling effect on democracy. How this is eliminating, checks and balances, which is the very core of democracy. This is what spyware is targeting, and that's why it's so dangerous. So yes, the Hungarian government has, in the tradition of the last 12 years, in the rudest of manners, declined to speak with us. But I would also like to point out that the other governments are not very helpful either.
Hello, thank you. This is Victoria Sherdut from HVG. Just a very quick follow-up question. You met with the National Security Committee in Parliament, right? They have a number of Fidesz MPs. Did they refuse to attend, or were you able to talk to them?
There are 6 members of the committee. We met with 2, the chairman, who is from the opposition, and the former chairman, I think, who is a member of the smaller government party. There was originally, I believe, also a member of the Fidesz party on the agenda, but we were informed as the meeting started that he was not participating. I don't have any official information as to why that was, but we met with these 2 members of the party, of the committee.
First here and then I.
My name is Balázs Márton from Telex, and you've also met with Mr. Péterfalvi. How would you describe this meeting? How useful was it? Are you satisfied with his questions, answers? And did you ask about the investigation that he concluded in this matter? Thank you.
Yes, I think a lot of the meeting we had was dedicated to the investigation that they concluded. Of course, we also have access to the investigation they concluded. I don't think. I mean, it was a useful meeting to have. It was constructive. It was. We were very happy that on a Monday night they took the time to meet with us. But I don't think that the answers we were given were entirely convincing in that way. And also there we have to look back a little bit in the history. I think the previous data protection president of the Data Protection Authority was sacked by the government. This in the end led to a court for the European Court of Justice who denounced this and also said it really put into question the independence of the authority as such. And this question of independence, I think, is still in a way hanging over the authority, also with regards to the independent the investigation that was pursued. I thought it was interesting with regards to the investigation that it almost seems to focus more on certain organizations or journalists who were at the forefront of actually bringing to the public this abuse scandal, rather than providing scrutiny to the government for the way that they have authorized this type of surveillance. I think Amnesty International is mentioned more times in the report than the Hungarian authorities, and I think it is problematic. We know also, and Sophie in 't Veld referred to this, that we have the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, which already states that there is no meaningful oversight and that the authority can actually not effectively do proper oversight of surveillance authorization by the Hungarian government. The authority itself has proposed amendments to legislation that should solve this. They were rejected by the government. So we have to conclude that at the moment, the effective oversight that you would expect from a data protection authority in a member state is not there. And the question that we have asked several occasions yesterday also to the National Data Protection Authority, the president, is how can you assess that if you investigate almost 100 cases, that all these cases are legal, that all these cases have pose such a huge risk to national security that they would require such invasive infringement of privacy rights of individuals in Hungary. And the only answer we got was always that we have looked at it and it's legal. But I think I refer back to the explanation of Sophie in 't Veld, which is also the question that Gwendolyn Double-Scorfield asked. There is, of course, a difference between legal and legitimate, and the fact that maybe the right signature was put on the right paper makes it legal in the procedural way and the interpretation of the authority, but that certainly does not mean that it was legitimate, and that certainly does not mean that it was necessary or proportionate. And I believe that a National Data Protection Authority should look at legitimacy, necessity, proportionality, and not only whether the correct procedures as such were followed.
Harsányi György vagyok a Népszavától. My question is, did you get any information on actually who authorized all this use of Pegasus software? Who was the person who authorized this in Hungary?
Well, I think there too, there's still, okay, we know some things. We know who's supposed to authorize. In some cases, the minister, when it's about national security. In some cases, a judge, when it's about, let's say, common crimes. We also know that in many cases, but we don't know how many cases, the minister had outsourced it to the state secretary. Apparently that was an existing practice, but very undesirable, because who is taking responsibility then in the end? And the point is again that the structures are such that you get no insight into what was in the request. How is a request justified? How is it then assessed? Who is overseeing all this? Because I understand it was explained to us this morning, and it was so complicated I can't really reproduce it, but basically the same Secretary of State who was doing the signing was also responsible for the oversight structures over the authorization. I mean, like, that's not serious. And then if you're a target of spyware, you have no idea. I mean, many of the people we spoke to didn't know who had authorized them being put under surveillance. And I think to also come back to the previous one, some of the key targets, let's say the high-profile targets, haven't even been heard by the Data Protection Authority or by the National Security Committee. So let's say some of the relevant oversight bodies. So all in all, if you look at, you have to look at the whole system, because we can look at one aspect or the other, but it's clear, as I said at the start, that every avenue of oversight, safeguards, remedy has been closed off. every single avenue. The only avenue that is left in many cases is going to either the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg or the court in Luxembourg. But even then you have to often go through the national judiciary first. So, you know, the whole authorization process is only part of the whole chain, but the whole chain is controlled by the government, in essence.
Köszönöm. Üdvözlöm Önöket, Konc Tamás vagyok a Magyar Hang hetilaptól. Én arra lennék kíváncsi, hogy mit gondolnak arról, hogy az igazságügyi államtitkár, aki ezeket a lehallgatási engedélyeket aláírta, őt magát is vesztegetésben, tehát vesztegetési ügyben lett vádlott. Látnak ebben nemzetbiztonsági kockázatot az eddigiek felett? Köszönöm.
I think we can give a very short answer to that. Yes.
Okay.
No more questions? Everyone satisfied? Yes.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all very much for your interest. And if there are any questions to any of the members of the delegation, please feel free to approach any one of us. Thank you. Warm here.
I'm approaching already. There's an interview request from